The year is 1215. A misty morning shrouds the meadow of Runnymede, the air thick with tension. On one side, King John of England, his face a mask of anxiety and barely concealed rage. On the other, the rebel barons, their armor glinting in the faint light, their expressions defiant, their banners snapping in the wind. This isn't just a meeting, it's a standoff that will echo through centuries. Scribes stand ready, their quills poised to document a moment that could shatter a kingdom or forge a new future. The very authority of the crown hangs in the balance. Will the king bend to their demands, or will he unleash the full force of his royal fury? What could possibly force a monarch, believed to be chosen by God, to this breaking point? To understand why this dramatic confrontation happened, we need to rewind the clock and look at the turbulent reign of King John, a story of ambition, betrayal, and a kingdom pushed to the very edge. John wasn't supposed to be king. He was the youngest son of the formidable Henry II and the brilliant Eleanor of Aquitaine. Nicknamed John Lackland because he initially received no land inheritance, he spent his early years in the shadow of his famous older brother, Richard the Lionheart. While Richard was off crusading, earning his legendary status, John was at home, scheming. He even tried to seize the throne while Richard was imprisoned abroad. This early ambition and willingness to betray his own family gave everyone a taste of the kind of man John would be. When Richard died in 1199, John finally got his chance. He became King of England, Lord of Ireland, and Duke of Normandy. He had the power he always craved. The problem was, he inherited a kingdom that was already in a precarious position. The vast Angevin Empire, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees in France, was a sprawling and difficult territory to manage. It was expensive, and more importantly, the French king, Philip Augustus, was a cunning rival determined to reclaim French lands from English control. John's reign was immediately defined by war. He was a capable military commander, but he was also unpredictable, cruel, and deeply distrustful. His French campaigns were a disaster. One by one, he lost crucial territories, including the vital Duchy of Normandy in 1204, the ancestral home of the English kings since William the Conqueror. This was a catastrophic blow not just to John's prestige, but to the pockets of his barons, many of whom held vast estates in both England and Normandy. They lost land, income, and influence. They blamed John, and their resentment began to simmer. Back in England, things weren't any better. To fund his failing wars, John needed money, and lots of it. He squeezed his kingdom dry. He raised a tax called scutage, a fee paid by knights to avoid military service to unprecedented levels, sometimes demanding it even when there was no war. He exploited his feudal rights ruthlessly, charging exorbitant fees for inheritances, forcing widows to marry men of his choosing, and seizing lands on the flimsiest of pretexts. He was creative in his cruelty, targeting anyone he suspected of disloyalty. He famously left the wife and son of a former favorite, William de Braose, to starve to death in a castle dungeon. Stories like these spread, painting a picture of a king who was not a protector of his people, but a predator. His justice system was a tool of extortion. Fines were arbitrary, and royal favor could be bought and sold. For the barons, this wasn't just unfair. It was a violation of the established customs and traditions that governed the relationship between a king and his vassals. Then came John's spectacular clash with the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, the Church. In 1205, the position of Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant. John wanted to appoint his own man, a loyal supporter. But the Pope, the formidable Innocent III, had his own candidate. What followed was a power struggle of epic proportions. When John refused to accept the Pope's choice, Pope Innocent placed all of England under an interdict in 1208. This was a spiritual lockdown. Churches were closed, no masses could be said, no weddings or funerals could be properly conducted, and the church bells fell silent across the land. For the deeply religious people of medieval England, this was terrifying. They believed their very souls were in peril. John, however, saw an opportunity. He seized church lands and revenues, filling his own treasury. The Pope retaliated by excommunicating John himself in 1209, effectively declaring him an outcast from the Christian world and, crucially, releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. This was an open invitation for rebellion. With his kingdom in spiritual crisis and his barons already seething, John faced the real threat of a French invasion, now sanctioned by the Pope. His back was against the wall. In a stunning reversal, John didn't just give in, he went all in. In 1213, he surrendered his entire kingdom to the Pope, receiving it back as a papal fiefdom. In essence, he made the Pope his feudal lord. It was a brilliant, if humiliating, political move. It immediately turned the Pope from his greatest enemy into his most powerful ally, and the threat of invasion vanished. But for the English barons, this was the final straw. Their king had lost their lands in France, bled them dry with taxes, ruled as a tyrant, and now he had subjected the entire kingdom to a foreign power. They felt he had betrayed England itself. With the Pope now on his side, John felt emboldened. He gathered his forces for one last, massive campaign to reclaim his French territories. He demanded his barons join him or pay a record-high scutage. Many refused. Despite this, John pushed ahead, launching his invasion in 1214. The campaign culminated in the disastrous Battle of Bouvines. While John was in the south, his main northern army, led by his allies, was decisively crushed by the French. It was a total, unmitigated failure. All the money, all the pressure, all the political maneuvering had come to nothing. John returned to England in late 1214, defeated, humiliated, and broke. He found his enemies waiting for him. The northern barons, who had been organizing for months, now had the support of many others who were furious about the failed campaign. They were united, armed, and they were done talking. In early 1215, the rebel barons renounced their oaths of fealty to the king, a formal declaration of rebellion. They presented John with a list of demands, a document known as the Articles of the Barons. This was their ultimatum. They weren't just complaining about high taxes anymore. They were demanding a fundamental change in how the kingdom was run. They wanted the king to be subject to the law, not above it. When John prevaricated, the rebels acted decisively. In May, they marched on and captured the city of London, the commercial and strategic heart of the kingdom. This was a game-changer. With London lost and his support crumbling, John had no choice. He was outmaneuvered and militarily cornered. He had to negotiate. And so we returned to that misty meadow at Runnymede in June 1215. The document that lay between the king and his rebellious subjects was the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was a peace treaty born from decades of royal overreach and baronial fury. It declared that no free man could be imprisoned or have his property seized without a proper legal process. It asserted that the king could not levy certain taxes without the consent of the kingdom. It established a council of 25 barons to ensure the king kept his promises, giving them the right to wage war on him if he failed. For the first time, it was written down that the king himself was subject to the rule of law. John sealed the charter, not because he believed in its principles, but because he had no other choice. In his mind, it was a temporary concession, a promise made under duress that he had every intention of breaking. And break it he did. Within weeks, he appealed to his new ally, the Pope, who declared the charter null and void. The country plunged into a brutal civil war, known as the First Barons' War. The rebels even offered the English crown to the French prince, Louis. John's reign ended not long after. In 1216, while campaigning in the east of England, he contracted dysentery and died. He was just 49 years old. His death probably saved the kingdom from a French takeover. With the hated king gone, English barons were more willing to rally around John's young son, the 9-year-old Henry III. To secure their loyalty, the regents governing for the young king immediately reissued the Magna Carta, it was reissued again and again over the following decades, stripped of its most radical clauses, but retaining its core principles. It transformed from a failed peace treaty into a foundational document of English law. It wasn't a charter of rights for all people, not yet. It was primarily about protecting the rights of the elite. But the ideas it contained that government should have limits, that there should be due process, that no one, not even the king, is above the law were revolutionary. These ideas would inspire future generations, not just in Britain, but across the world, influencing legal systems and becoming a powerful symbol of liberty. The story of Magna Carta shows how the actions of a single, terrible king could, quite accidentally, plant the seeds of freedom. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into medieval history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Let us know in the comments which historical moment you'd like to see us cover next. We'll see you in the next one.
History isn't just what happened, it's what was hidden. Welcome to the Chrono Archives, where lost empires rise again, forgotten legends speak, and ancient truths are brought back to life. From world-shaping history and powerful myths to legendary rulers and timeless civilizations, every story here is carefully uncovered, deeply researched, and cinematically told. The past is calling, will you answer? Subscribe and journey through time, one unforgettable chronicle at a time.
Step back in time with me to an era of stone castles, bustling towns, and a kingdom on the brink. This is England in the early 13th century, a land ruled by one of history's most infamous monarchs, King John. Imagine the scene, majestic castles casting long shadows over the countryside, a symbol of royal power. Below, in the towns and villages, life is a tapestry of struggle and survival. The air is thick, not just with the smoke from hearths and forges, but with a palpable tension, a quiet hum of discontent that grows louder with each passing day. King John, a man forever etched in folklore as the villain of Robin Hood, was a real historical figure with real, and often disastrous, policies. His reign was marked by an insatiable need for money. We see him in his court, surrounded by advisors, demanding ever higher taxes from his subjects. His ambition was vast, but his military campaigns, particularly in France, were colossal failures. He lost vast territories, including the prized Duchy of Normandy, which had been in English hands for generations. These defeats were not just embarrassing, they were incredibly expensive. And who bore the cost? The people of England. Let's focus on the barons, the powerful noblemen of the realm. Picture them in a great hall, their faces etched with frustration and anger. For years, they had funded John's wars, provided him with knights, and supported his crown. In return, they expected the king to respect their traditional rights and privileges. But John was different. He saw their wealth as his personal treasury. He imposed scutage, a fee paid to get out of military service, at an unprecedented rate. He seized lands, forced widows into marriages of his choosing, and held heirs for ransom. The relationship between the king and his most powerful subjects was fraying, thread by thread. Meanwhile, what about the ordinary people? The peasants, the merchants, the artisans? For them, the king's demands were a crushing weight. We see a farmer, his face weathered by the sun and toil, handing over his last few coins to a grim-faced tax collector. His family watches, their meager meal for the evening now uncertain. In the towns, merchants find their goods seized and their trade disrupted by arbitrary royal decrees. The dream of a stable, prosperous life seemed to be slipping away for everyone. The promise of justice, a cornerstone of any kingdom, felt hollow. The king, who was supposed to be the ultimate protector of his people, had become their greatest predator. This widespread suffering wasn't happening in a vacuum. Discontent began to brew and then boil over. In taverns and town squares, hushed whispers turned into open complaints. The barons, realizing they were not alone in their grievances, began to communicate, to strategize. They were bound by a shared sense of injustice. They had tried petitioning the king, debating policy with his advisors, and seeking peaceful resolutions. But King John was notoriously stubborn and untrustworthy. He would agree to terms one day and break his promise the next. The turning point came as the barons started to unite. This was no small feat. These were proud, powerful men, often rivals for land and influence. But King John's tyranny was so extreme that it forged an unlikely alliance. They began to meet in secret, drafting a list of demands, a charter of liberties that would codify the limits of royal power. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were articulating a principle that the king was not above the law. This was a radical idea, a direct challenge to the very concept of absolute monarchy that had governed for centuries. The tension escalated dramatically. King John saw this coalition not as a negotiation, but as a rebellion. He raised his own armies, prepared his castles for siege, and refused to back down. The barons, in turn, renounced their oaths of fealty to him, a grave and defiant act. England was teetering on the edge of a full-blown civil war. The fields that should have been plowed for the spring harvest were instead being eyed for battle. The horizon, once a symbol of endless possibility, was now dark with the storm clouds of conflict. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation. The barons were organized, determined, and ready to act. They had the support of a populace weary of tyranny. But the question that hung in the air was a heavy one. Just how far would King John resist? Would he plunge his kingdom into a bloody civil war to protect his absolute power, or could he be forced to the negotiating table? The fate of England, and indeed the future of law and liberty, was about to be decided. The story of Magna Carta was about to begin. Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the past fascinating, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. The air in England grew thick with conspiracy. Away from the prying eyes of the royal court, in the cold stone halls of their strongholds and along the muddy country roads, a storm was brewing. This wasn't just discontent anymore, it was the birth of a rebellion. We're now entering the first phase of escalation, the Baron Revolt. The camera zooms in on the faces of England's most powerful barons. These aren't just angry men, they are seasoned strategists, landowners, and warriors. Look at their expressions, a mixture of determination, fear, and righteous anger. They huddle over hand-drawn maps, their fingers tracing the paths to royal castles, their voices low and urgent as they coordinate a unified strategy. For years, they had endured King John's heavy taxes, his arbitrary justice, and his military failures. The loss of Normandy wasn't just a political blow. It was a personal one, costing them lands and prestige. The final straw had been John's disastrous campaign in France, culminating in the defeat at Bouvines. Now, their patience had shattered. Each whispered conversation, each clandestine meeting, was a thread being woven into a tapestry of open revolt. They invoked ancient rights and liberties, claiming the king had broken a sacred pact with his people. This wasn't merely a power grab. In their eyes, it was a fight to restore balance and law to the realm. They sent secret messengers across the country, their missions fraught with peril. A single captured letter, a single betrayal, could mean a gruesome death. Yet, the network grew stronger with each passing day. From the northern moors to the southern coasts, a consensus was forming. King John must be forced to heel, or he must be removed. While the barons plotted, King John was far from oblivious. He was a deeply suspicious and intelligent ruler, his network of spies just as extensive as the barons' network of allies. In his own chambers, the king strategized defensively. He knew the identities of his chief enemies, men like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey. He wasn't just sitting back and waiting for the inevitable attack. He began reinforcing his key castles, moving his treasury to more secure locations, and attempting to sow division among the rebels. He sent letters to the Pope, seeking his powerful support and condemnation of the traitors. John was a survivor, a political fighter who had navigated treacherous waters his entire life. He wouldn't give up his crown without a fight. The tension was palpable across the kingdom. In the armories, the clang of hammer on steel was a constant rhythm. Knights, loyal to their respective lords, were preparing for the unthinkable, a war against their own countrymen, perhaps even against their king. We see them sharpening their swords, polishing their helmets, their faces grim. These were men bound by oaths of fealty, and now those oaths were pulling them in opposite directions. Would they follow their local lord, the man who granted them land and protection, or their anointed king, God's chosen ruler on earth? Banners bearing the distinct coats of arms of powerful families were unfurled, no longer for a crusade abroad, but for a conflict at home. The threat of civil war was no longer a distant possibility. It was a looming, terrifying reality. The fabric of English society was about to be torn apart. This brings us to a critical question, a micro-question that everyone from the lowest peasant to the highest noble must have been asking themselves: could the king survive this revolt? He had the authority of the crown, control of the royal army, and a cunning political mind. But the barons had immense wealth, private armies, and a powerful, unifying cause. They were organized and deeply motivated. The odds were more evenly matched than any rebellion the kingdom had seen in generations. The stage was set for a monumental confrontation, a clash that would test the very foundations of monarchy and law in England. And so, the pieces were set on the chessboard of history. The plotting, the arming, the defensive maneuvering, it was all leading to a single, inevitable point of collision. Forces began to gather, marching from all corners of the kingdom, summoned by loyalty and conviction. All sides converged on one place where history would be written, a place that would become synonymous with the struggle for liberty itself. This convergence would lead directly to the creation of a document that would echo through the centuries. But first, there would be the march, the standoff, and the tense negotiations that brought England to the very brink of all-out war. The spring of 1215 was a season of profound change in England, a time when the very foundations of the kingdom seemed to shift. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and new blossoms, also carried the unmistakable scent of rebellion. After the fall of London, the momentum was undeniably with the barons. Their victory in the capital was more than just a military triumph. It was a powerful symbol, a declaration that their cause had resonated far beyond their own ranks. Citizens who had once been loyal subjects of the crown, or at least appeared to be, now openly sided with the rebels. The loss of London was a crippling blow to King John, not just strategically, but psychologically. It demonstrated the breadth of the discontent, proving that this was no mere squabble among the elite, but a widespread uprising. The barons, emboldened by this success, knew they had to press their advantage. They began to consolidate their power, their forces swelling with new recruits from across the country. Every disgruntled landowner, every merchant tired of extortionate taxes, every knight who felt his honor slighted by the king, saw a banner to rally under. The baronial army was no longer a disparate collection of individual lords and their retinues. It was transforming into a cohesive and formidable military force. They established a new administrative center in London, a parallel government that openly challenged the king's authority. From this stronghold, they issued decrees, collected revenues, and planned their next move with a confidence they had never before possessed. The message was clear. They were not just rebels, they were the alternative. For King John, the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. He had retreated to his fortress at Windsor, a formidable castle, but one that now felt more like a cage. From its stone ramparts, he could see the smoke of the city he had lost, a constant, galling reminder of his failure. His court, once a bustling hub of power and influence, was now a tense and paranoid echo chamber. Loyalties were questioned, whispers of betrayal filled the corridors, and every arriving messenger was met with a mixture of hope and dread. John, a man known for his volatile temper and deep-seated paranoia, found himself isolated. He had alienated many of his most powerful nobles, and those who remained loyal did so out of fear or self-interest, not love or respect. He was a king cornered, and like any cornered animal, he was dangerous. The choice of Runnymede as the meeting place was no accident. This ancient water meadow on the banks of the Thames, situated almost exactly halfway between the king's position at Windsor and the barons' base in London, was symbolic neutral ground. It was a place steeped in history, a traditional site for councils and assemblies dating back to Anglo-Saxon times. The name itself, derived from the Old English Runnymede meaning council, and mead for meadow, literally meant council meadow. Choosing this location was a deliberate act, suggesting that what was about to take place was not a surrender, but a negotiation, a council to settle the affairs of the realm. But despite the symbolism of peace, the preparations on both sides were anything but peaceful. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, caught between the two armed camps. As the day of the proposed meeting drew near, the landscape around Runnymede transformed. The tranquil meadows and dense forests that lined the Thames became a vast military staging ground. The Baron's army began its march from London, a slow, deliberate procession designed to intimidate. This was not a swift raid. It was a strategic advance, a river of steel and color flowing through the English countryside. At the head of the column rode the great lords, men like Robert Fitzwalter and Eustace de Vesey, their armor gleaming in the intermittent spring sunlight. Their faces were set, a mixture of grim determination and nervous anticipation. Years of frustration, of broken promises, and royal tyranny had brought them to this point. They had risked everything, their lands, their titles, their very lives on this one final gamble. Behind them, the army stretched for miles. Thousands of men at arms, their chainmail jingling with each step, marched in disciplined ranks. Their leather boots trampled the soft earth, turning green paths into muddy tracks. Archers with their longbows slung over their shoulders walked alongside crossbowmen, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of a royal ambush. Supply wagons, their wooden wheels groaning under the weight of food, wine, and arrows, trundled along, escorted by hardened sergeants. And above it all flew the banners, a vibrant tapestry of defiance. Each banner represented a family, a lineage, a personal grievance against the king. The De Vere star, the De Clare chevrons, the big odd cross, they fluttered in the breeze, a defiant and colorful challenge to the singular banner of the Golden Lions of England. From his vantage point at Windsor, King John could observe the enemy's approach. Spies and heralds rode back and forth, their horses lathered in sweat, bringing tense updates. They spoke of the rebels' numbers, their discipline, their unshakable resolve. John, himself an experienced military commander, knew the threat was real. He rode out from the castle, not in a grand procession, but with a small, heavily armed retinue. His expression was a mask of conflicting emotions. There was the flicker of his infamous rage, the anger of a king being dictated to by his subjects. But there was also a deep-seated anxiety, a nervous twitch at the corner of his eye, the gnawing fear that he was losing control. He was a king accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. The idea of negotiating, of conceding power, was anathema to his very nature. Yet, he knew his options were dwindling. The tension in the air was palpable, a physical presence you could almost taste. It settled like the morning mist that rose from the river, clinging to the fields and forests. On both sides, sentries stood watch, their hands rarely leaving the hilts of their swords. Every distant sound, a snapping twig, the cry of a bird, the whinny of a horse made them jump. The soldiers, camped in their respective positions, spoke in low, hushed tones. They polished their weapons, not just for maintenance, but as a ritual to calm their nerves. They gambled with dice, told grim jokes, and thought of the homes and families they had left behind. They were pawns in a great game, and they knew that the next move could be their last. The stakes had been raised to their absolute peak. This was no longer about petitions or grievances, it was about survival. The central question hung over the meadows of Runnymede like a gathering storm cloud. Would negotiation succeed, or would blood be spilled? Could these two sides, separated by a chasm of mistrust and hatred, find common ground in words? Or was the die already cast for war? Would the tranquil green of the council meadow be stained red with the blood of Englishmen? King John, the tyrant, faced Robert Fitzwalter, the rebel. The divine right of kings clashed with the nascent concept of law and liberty. It was a confrontation that had been building for years, a pressure cooker of political, economic, and personal animosity. Now, it was about to explode. Everything the barons had fought for, everything John had struggled to keep, now depended on the events at Runnymede. The future of England, the very relationship between the ruler and the ruled, was about to be decided on this small patch of land by the river. Runnymede Meadow, June 15, 1215. The air is thick with mist and tension. A heavy silence hangs over the powerful men gathered here, broken only by the scratch of a quill on parchment. This is King John of England, a monarch cornered, not by a foreign army, but by his own furious barons. You can almost feel the weight of their gaze on his back. They're watching his every move, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. Look closely at the scene unfolding. This isn't a grand, willing gesture of a benevolent king, it's an act of desperation. The quill in John's hand is more than just a writing instrument. It's a symbol of a power struggle that has reached its breaking point. Each stroke of ink on this parchment, which we now call Magna Carta, is a concession, a piece of his absolute authority being chipped away. The document itself is a mess of clauses, a laundry list of grievances from the disgruntled nobility. We're talking about unfair taxes, abuse of power, and a justice system that served only the king. The barons have had enough. Now, let's shatter a common myth right away. Magna Carta wasn't some enlightened declaration of human rights for all people, not even close. At its heart, it was a practical agreement, a peace treaty between two warring factions within England's elite. Most of its 63 clauses were about specific feudal rights and the privileges of the church and the barons. The average peasant in 1215 wouldn't have even known this was happening, let alone felt any immediate benefit from it. The idea that this was the birth of democracy is a much later interpretation, a story we've told ourselves over centuries. So, as John presses his royal seal into the warm wax, the big question hanging in the misty air is this: will this piece of paper truly limit the king's power? Can a document, no matter how solemnly sworn, actually chain a monarch who believes he is appointed by God? The barons certainly hope so. They see this charter as a binding contract, a set of rules that even the king must follow. They're banking on the power of the written word, backed by the threat of renewed civil war if John dares to violate it. But let's think about John's perspective. He was known for his cunning and his ruthlessness. Do you really think he intended to honor this agreement forced upon him under duress? For him, this was a strategic retreat, a way to buy time, to scatter his enemies and regroup. He was playing the long game. As he hands the sealed charter over, there's no look of defeat in his eyes, but perhaps a glint of calculation. He's already thinking about his next move. This is a crucial moment because it introduces a radical new idea into English politics, the concept of the rule of law. The principle that no one, not even the king, is above the law. Before Magna Carta, the king's will was the law. Now, for the first time, there's a written standard against which his actions can be measured. Clause 39, for example, is one of the most famous. It states that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This is the seed that would later blossom into the right to a fair trial and due process. It was a revolutionary concept, but a seed needs time to grow. The immediate aftermath of the signing was not one of peace and harmony. In fact, the signing didn't end the conflict at all. It only set the stage for what came next. King John had no intention of keeping his promises. Almost immediately after the barons disbanded, he sought help from the Pope to have Magna Carta annulled. Pope Innocent III, a powerful ally of the king, declared the charter null and void, calling it a shameful and demeaning agreement forced upon the king by violence and fear. This papal declaration was the spark that reignited the flames of war. England was plunged back into a brutal civil conflict, known as the First Barons' War. The country was torn apart. The barons, feeling betrayed, went to the extreme length of inviting a foreign prince, Louis of France, to invade and claim the English throne. This shows just how deep the mistrust and hatred for King John ran. The country was in chaos, with foreign troops on English soil and castles under siege across the land. Then, in the middle of this chaos, fate intervened. In October 1216, just over a year after the signing at Runnymede, King John died. He wasn't killed in battle, but fell ill with dysentery while on campaign. His death completely changed the political landscape. With the hated king gone, the main reason for the rebellion vanished. John's heir was his 9-year-old son, Henry III. The loyalist barons, the ones who had stuck with John, acted quickly and shrewdly. They knew they needed to win back the support of the rebels, and what was their most powerful tool? Magna Carta. They reissued the charter in the young king's name in 1216, and again in 1217, and a final, definitive version in 1225, but they weren't the same. They edited it, removing the most radical clauses that had restricted the king's power too much. What they kept were the principles, the idea of lawful governance. This is the real, and perhaps more interesting, story of Magna Carta. It wasn't a single event, but the beginning of a long, evolutionary process. It wasn't the document signed by King John in 1215 that became law, but the reissued versions that followed. Its survival depended on its usefulness. For the young King Henry III's regents, it was a manifesto to rally support and end the Civil War. For the barons, it was a guarantee of their rights. Over the centuries, it was confirmed and reconfirmed by successive kings, each time embedding it deeper into the fabric of English law and identity. Its meaning also evolved. While it started as a document for the elite, its principles of justice and lawful rule were so powerful that they were gradually expanded and applied more broadly. Lawyers and parliamentarians in the 17th century, fighting against the absolute power of the Stuart kings, rediscovered Magna Carta and held it up as an ancient symbol of English liberties. They saw in its clauses a foundation for the rights of all Englishmen, not just the nobility. This is how Magna Carta traveled across the Atlantic. The American colonists, who saw themselves as Englishmen entitled to the same rights, used the Charter's principles to justify their own revolution. When they protested against taxation without representation, they were echoing the grievances of the barons in 1215. The ideas in Magna Carta are woven directly into the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, particularly the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process of law, which is a direct descendant of Clause 39. So, when we look back at that misty morning in Runnymede, we're not just seeing a medieval king being forced to sign a document. We're witnessing the birth of an idea that government should be by consent, that power should be limited, and that all are subject to the law. Magna Carta's journey from a failed peace treaty to a global symbol of freedom is a testament to the enduring power of that idea. It's a story of failure, war, political maneuvering, and the slow, often messy, march toward liberty. The document itself may have been a product of its time, but the principles it stood for have proven to be timeless. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey back to 1215 fascinating, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's most pivotal moments. Let me know in the comments what you think is Magna Carta's most important legacy. See you in the next video. The ink on the parchment was barely dry, but the battle for England's soul was far from over. The fields of Runnymede fell silent, but inside the cold stone walls of nearby castles, a new kind of conflict was just beginning. This wasn't a war of swords and shields, but one of words, wills, and the very definition of power. The Magna Carta was signed, yes, but would it be honored? This is the story of the tense, nail-biting days that followed, where the future of liberty hung precariously in the balance. Imagine the scene: Windsor Castle, the air thick with suspicion. King John, his royal pride wounded, sits across a heavy oak table from the very barons who had forced his hand. His expression is a storm of resentment and cunning. He had agreed to their demands, but every fiber of his being, conditioned by the divine right of kings, screamed in protest. He saw the charter not as a revolutionary document of freedom, but as a temporary concession, a strategic retreat to buy himself time. His mind was already racing, plotting ways to unravel what he had just sealed. Across from him sat the leaders of the rebellion. Men like Robert Fitzwalter, their faces etched with the fatigue of conflict, but hardened with resolve. They were not naive, they knew John's reputation. They knew his promises were as fragile as a winter's frost. For them, the piece of parchment they held was everything. It was the culmination of years of grievances, of unjust taxes, of arbitrary rule. They had risked their lands, their titles, their very lives for this moment, and they were not about to let it slip away. Their knights stood silently along the walls, hands resting on the pommels of their swords, a constant, unspoken reminder of the force that backed their demands. Caught in the middle were the clergy, led by the influential Archbishop Stephen Langton. Langton, a key architect of the charter, now found himself in the precarious role of mediator. He had to navigate the treacherous waters between a king desperate to reclaim his absolute authority and a group of barons determined to hold him to his word. His task was to transform this fragile truce into a lasting peace, to turn the ink on the page into the law of the land. He reasoned, he cajoled, he reminded both sides of the alternative, a devastating civil war that would tear the kingdom apart. The negotiations were grueling. Clause by clause, they dissected the document. John would push back, arguing over interpretations, trying to find loopholes. This clause, he might declare, pointing a finger at a line limiting his ability to raise taxes, infringes upon the crown's ancient rights to defend the realm. The barons would counter, their voices firm, "No, your majesty. It infringes upon your right to plunder your subjects for foreign wars they do not support." Each point was a battle. The tension was so thick you could feel it in the air, a silent hum of clashing ideologies. The authority of one man versus the rule of law for all. One of the most contentious points was Clause 61, the Security Clause. This was the true revolution within the charter. It established a council of 25 barons with the power to overrule the king, and even seize his castles and possessions if he failed to uphold the agreement. To John, this was an unthinkable humiliation, a direct assault on the very foundation of monarchy. He saw it as legalizing rebellion. He resisted it with every ounce of his political skill. But the barons were unyielding. This was their insurance policy. Without it, the Magna Carta was just a list of suggestions. They knew that without a mechanism for enforcement, John would discard the charter the moment their army disbanded. They made it clear, no security clause, no peace. The knights standing guard were a physical manifestation of this ultimatum. Their silent presence spoke volumes, a constant threat of renewed warfare. The king, looking at the grim faces of the men who held his kingdom hostage, knew he was cornered, for now. With immense reluctance, under the combined pressure of the barons' steel and the church's diplomacy, John conceded. He agreed to the enforcement mechanisms. He allowed the barons to begin the process of taking control of key strongholds, including the City of London, as collateral. A collective, fragile sigh of relief echoed through the halls. The immediate crisis seemed to have been averted. The armies began to stand down, and a semblance of order returned to the fractured kingdom. The barons had won. The king had been bound by the law. But as the dust settled, a new reality began to dawn. This piece of parchment, born from a feudal dispute between a king and his nobles, contained ideas far bigger than any of them could have imagined. Concepts like trial by jury, protection from illegal imprisonment, and the principle that even a king was not above the law. These were seeds of liberty, planted in the soil of a medieval power struggle. While the immediate dispute had subsided for a moment, the legacy of the Magna Carta was just beginning its long, arduous journey. King John had not been defeated, he had merely been delayed. And the principles enshrined in that document would have to be fought for, defended, and reinterpreted again and again through the centuries. The signing at Runnymede wasn't an end, but a beginning. The true impact of this great charter would echo far beyond the stone walls of Windsor, shaping the very course of history in ways no one present could have ever foreseen. Thank you for watching. If you're fascinated by how these historical moments shaped our world, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in our journey. See you next time. The ink was barely dry on the parchment, but the air in England was already changing. The year is 1215, and the Magna Carta has just been sealed. This wasn't an instant revolution, not a sudden dawn of democracy. Instead, it was the start of a slow, cautious dance between a reluctant king and his determined barons. Imagine the scene: King John, his power now visibly checked, meeting with the barons not on a battlefield, but in council chambers. The clashing of swords was replaced by the rustle of papers and the murmur of careful negotiation. The barons, once rebels, were now becoming something more akin to political stakeholders, tasked with ensuring the king upheld his promises. A committee of 25 barons was established, a watchdog council, a constant reminder to the crown that it was no longer above the law. This was a fragile peace, a truce built on mistrust and necessity, but it was a start. Down in the towns and villages, word of the Great Charter spread slowly, carried by merchants, priests, and travelers. For the average person, a farmer or a craftsman, the immediate changes were subtle. They wouldn't have read the document themselves, most were illiterate, but they would have heard whispers. Whispers that the king could no longer seize their property without due cause. Whispers that arbitrary fines and taxes might become a thing of the past. These weren't grand declarations of individual freedom as we know them today, but they were seeds of security. In the markets of London or the fields of Kent, you might see a royal official acting with a little more restraint, a local sheriff thinking twice before imposing a crippling penalty. This was the charter in action, not as a lofty ideal, but as a practical, day-to-day shift in the balance of power. The fear of unchecked royal authority began to recede, replaced by a tentative hope for stability and fairness. Meanwhile, within the stone walls of monasteries and cathedrals, the clergy played a crucial role. They were the keepers of knowledge, the scribes and chroniclers of the age. It was their hands that copied the Magna Carta, creating the multiple versions that were distributed across the kingdom. Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury, had been a key mediator in the conflict, and his influence ensured the Church's support. These clerical scribes weren't just duplicating text, they were preserving an idea. By documenting the events, by ensuring the charter was read aloud in cathedrals, they were embedding it into the nation's consciousness. They understood its significance, not just as a peace treaty, but as a foundational statement about the relationship between the ruler and the ruled. Their quiet, scholarly work was as vital as the barons' armed defiance in ensuring the charter would not be forgotten. But let's be clear, King John had no intention of honoring the Magna Carta. He saw it as a temporary humiliation, a document signed under duress. Almost as soon as the barons dispersed from Runnymede, he sought help from the Pope, who swiftly annulled the charter, declaring it illegal and void. This plunged England back into civil war, the First Barons' War. It seemed as though the entire effort had been for nothing, that the Great Charter was destined to be a footnote in a failed rebellion. The castles once again became fortresses, and the fields became battlegrounds. Prince Louis of France was even invited by the rebellious barons to take the English throne, and for a time, it looked as though the Plantagenet dynasty might collapse entirely. The initial aftermath of Magna Carta wasn't peace and progress, it was chaos and conflict. The turning point came with an unexpected event: King John's death in 1216. He died of dysentery while on campaign, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, as heir. Suddenly, the political landscape was transformed. The Loyalist faction, led by the brilliant Regent William Marshal, saw an opportunity. To win back the support of the wavering barons and unify the country against the French invasion, they did something remarkable. They reissued the Magna Carta. They voluntarily placed the same limits on the young king's power that had been forced upon his father. This act changed everything. The charter was no longer a rebel document. It was a manifesto for legitimate, lawful government. It became the rallying point for English unity. Barons who had sided with Louis began to switch their allegiance back to the young English king, who now represented the principles of the charter. This reissued charter of 1216 and subsequent versions in 1217 and 1225 were slightly different from the original. Some of the more radical clauses aimed directly at King John were removed, but the core principles remained. The king was subject to the law, and free men had rights that could not be trampled. With each reissue, the Magna Carta became more ingrained in English law and political culture. It moved from being a peace treaty to a statute, a fundamental part of the kingdom's legal framework. Young King Henry III grew up in a world where his authority was understood to be limited by this document. The royal court still had immense power, of course, but the assumption of absolute, unchecked monarchy was broken. A new precedent had been set, where governance was a negotiation, not simply a command. This new stability had a profound social impact. With the crown's ability to exact arbitrary taxes and fines curtailed, trade and commerce could flourish with greater predictability. Merchants felt more secure in their investments, knowing their wealth wouldn't be whimsically confiscated. This legal security contributed to the growth of towns and the rise of a confident merchant class. This created a more stable social structure, where status and wealth were less dependent on the unpredictable favor of the king. It wasn't a revolution in social mobility, but it solidified the foundations of the existing social order, making it less vulnerable to the whims of a single ruler. The castle, once a symbol of a lord's power over his people, was now also a symbol of his rights and protections against the king. Of course, the benefits weren't distributed equally. The charter famously speaks of free men. This primarily meant the landowning elite, the barons, knights, and wealthy merchants. The vast majority of the population, the unfree peasants or villeins who were tied to the land they worked, were largely excluded from its direct protections. Their lives were still governed by the customs of their local manor and the will of their lord. For them, the king's power was distant. The lord's power was immediate and absolute. So, while the Magna Carta was a huge step forward for the political nation, it did little to immediately alter the daily lives of the peasantry. The social hierarchy remained firmly in place. However, the very idea that a king's power should be limited would, over many generations, trickle down and inspire broader struggles for rights and freedoms for all people, not just the privileged few. So, as the dust settled from the Barons' War and the reign of Henry III began, England was a changed nation. It was reborn not as a tool of rebellion, but as an instrument of legitimate government. The barons had successfully consolidated their influence, transforming from mere subjects into a powerful political class with defined rights. The king, while still the supreme head of the kingdom, was now politically constrained by a legal document he and his government had to uphold. Society began to stabilize, built on a new foundation of legal predictability that benefited landowners and merchants. It was a subtle, complex, and imperfect transformation. The document's true significance, its evolution into a global symbol of liberty and the rule of law, would unfold over centuries, far beyond the imagination of the men who first gathered in that meadow at Runnymede. Thank you so much for watching this journey through the immediate aftermath of the Magna Carta. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what you think was the most important immediate consequence of the Charter. See you next time. Welcome back to our journey through history. We've seen a king brought to heel, a rebellion that shook a nation, and a document born from crisis. But what happened after the ink dried on the Magna Carta? Did this piece of parchment, sealed under duress in a muddy field, truly change the world? That's the story we're telling today, the incredible, enduring legacy of the Magna Carta. So, King John signed the charter, but let's be honest, he had no intention of honoring it. Almost immediately, he got the Pope to declare it void. This led to a full-blown civil war, known as the First Barons' War. It seemed like the Magna Carta was dead on arrival, a failed treaty that would be forgotten by history. But history has a funny way of surprising us. When King John died a year later in 1216, his son, Henry III, was just 9 years old. The regents ruling in his name needed to win back the support of the barons and end the war. Their solution: reissue the Magna Carta. They took out some of the more radical clauses, but kept the core principles intact. This act transformed the charter from a rebel manifesto into an official instrument of government. It was reissued again in 1217, and then again in 1225 by Henry III himself, this time in exchange for a new tax. This 1225 version is the one that became part of English law. Over the next few centuries, the Magna Carta was confirmed and reconfirmed by successive monarchs dozens of times. Each confirmation was a public declaration that the king was not above the law. It became a powerful symbol. Whenever a king tried to overstep his authority, Parliament and the people would point to the Magna Carta. It wasn't always successful, and kings often ignored it, but the principle was now embedded in the English political consciousness. The idea that even the most powerful ruler had limits was no longer a radical thought, it was a foundational belief. One of the most crucial principles was the idea of due process. Clause 39, which we've talked about, states that no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, or stripped of his rights except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This is the seed from which our modern concepts of trial by jury and habeas corpus grew. Habeas corpus, the right to challenge unlawful detention before a judge, is a direct descendant of this clause. It ensures that the state can't just lock you up and throw away the key without justification. This single idea is a cornerstone of liberty in free societies around the world. As England's influence spread, so did the ideas of the Magna Carta. When English settlers traveled to the Americas, they brought their legal traditions with them. They saw themselves as Englishmen, entitled to the same rights and protections. When they felt the British Crown was infringing on those rights, imposing taxes without consent, denying them fair trials, they looked back to the Magna Carta as their justification for resistance. You can see its fingerprints all over the founding documents of the United States. The Declaration of Independence echoes its spirit of holding rulers accountable. The U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights draw directly from its principles. The Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process of law is a near-direct quote. The right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury, that's Magna Carta's legacy. The protection against excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishment found in the Eighth Amendment. You can trace its roots back to 1215. They saw it as the ancient charter of their liberties, a precedent for limiting government power and protecting individual freedoms. It provided the historical and legal backbone for their revolution and the new form of government they were creating. And its influence didn't stop there. The Magna Carta became a global symbol of freedom and the rule of law. When people around the world fought against tyranny and for constitutional government, they often invoked its name. It inspired the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948. Article 9 of the Declaration, which states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, is a modern echo of the promises made to those barons at Runnymede. Think about it. From a medieval peace treaty designed to solve a very specific political crisis, we get a universal principle. Power must have limits. Government must operate according to the law, and every individual possesses fundamental rights that cannot be swept aside. This is the great arc of the Magna Carta story. Of course, we have to be realistic. The original document was a product of its time. It was primarily concerned with the rights of free men, a small elite in the 13th century. It didn't apply to the vast majority of the population who were unfree peasants. It was a deeply flawed and class-based document. But over time, its principles were expanded and democratized. The free men of 1215 eventually became all people. The rights once reserved for the nobility were gradually claimed by everyone. The Charter's power lies not just in what it said, but in what it came to represent. It became a seed that, once planted, grew into something far grander and more inclusive than its creators ever imagined. Today, when you vote in an election, when you're presumed innocent until proven guilty, when you have the right to a fair trial, you are living the legacy of the Magna Carta. It is woven into the very fabric of our legal and political systems. It's in the quiet authority of a courtroom, the checks and balances of government, and the fundamental belief that no one, not a king, not a president, not a prime minister, is above the law. So, as we close this chapter, we're left with a powerful reflection. A king's reluctant signature in 1215 on a document he intended to discard still shapes the very definition of justice today. Its journey from a failed treaty to a global icon of liberty is a testament to the enduring power of an idea. But it also leaves us with a lingering question, one that every generation must answer for itself. Could one document, forged in a distant past, ever truly limit power forever? Or is the struggle for liberty, the fight to hold power accountable, a battle that must be fought and won, over and over again? Thank you for watching. If you found this journey into the past insightful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how history shapes our present.
As we close this chapter of the Chrono Archives, remember, the past is never truly gone. It waits patiently in the shadows of forgotten ruins, in the echoes of ancient voices, and in the timeless lessons that still guide us today. It waits to be remembered by curious minds like yours. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey through the annals of time. If today's exploration of lost civilizations, mythical legends, or historical enigmas ignited your passion for the past, hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite moment or what you'd love to see next, and most importantly, subscribe to the Chrono Archives and continue the journey through time. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode where we unearth buried secrets, decode ancient mysteries, and bring history's greatest stories back to life. Together, we'll keep the flame of the past burning bright. Until next time, fellow time travelers, keep questioning, keep discovering, and keep remembering. The Chrono Archives, where the past lives forever.